In this video, we'll be talking about the process of user stories. On an ideal project, we would have a single person who will prioritize the work for developers, who will answer their questions, and who will use the software when it is finished. And the same person can write all these stories also. Now, this is almost always too much to hope for. So we establish a customer team. The customer team includes those who ensure that the software will meet the need of its intended users. This means the customer team may include different types of category of people like testers, product managers, real users, interaction designers, and so on. Basically, the important question is why does the customer will write the stories? The customer team rather than the developers write these stories for two primary reasons. First, each story must be written in the language of the business and not in the technical jargons, so that the customer team can prioritize the stories for inclusion into the iterations and releases. Second, as the primary product visionaries, the customer team is in the best position to describe the behavior of the product. So what will the process be like? A project team that is using stories will have a different feel and rhythm than you may be used to with different development life cycles. So using a traditional waterfall oriented process leads to cycle of writing all the requirements, analyzing the requirements, designing the solution, coding the solution, and then finally testing it. Very often during this type of process, customers and users are involved at the beginning to write requirements and at the end to accept the software. But users and customer involvement may almost entirely disappear between the requirements and the acceptance phase. So by now we have learned that this does not work. The first thing you will notice on a story-driven project is that customers and users remain involved throughout the duration of the project. They are not expected or allowed to disappear during the middle phases of the project. So this is true whether the team will be using extreme programming or some kind of agile version of unified process or some agile process like Scrum or some story-driven agile process, but this will remain same. That the users and the customers are not allowed to disappear during the middle phases of the project. The customers and intended users of the new software should plan on taking a very active role in writing the user stories, and especially if you are using extreme programming. The story writing process is best started by considering the types of users of the intended system. For example, if you are building a travel reservation website, so you may have to consider the user types such as frequent flyers, vacation planners, and so on. The customer team should include representatives of as many of these user types which are practical. A project's initial stories are often written in a story writing workshop, but stories can be written at any time throughout the project. During the story writing workshop, everyone brainstorms as many stories as possible. With the starting set of stories, the developers estimates the size of each story. Collaboratively, the customer team and developers select an iteration length, which generally ranges from 1 week to 4 weeks. And the same iteration length will be used for the duration of the project. By the end of each iteration, the developers will be responsible for delivering fully usable code of the application. The customer team remains highly involved during the iterations, talking with the developers about the stories being developed during the iteration. During the iteration, the customer's team also specifies certain number of tests and works with the developers to automate and run those tests. Additionally, the customer team makes sure the project is constantly moving towards delivery of the desired project. Once an iteration length has been selected, the developers will estimate how much work they will be able to do in each iteration, per iteration. Now this concept is called as velocity. The amount of work which can be done in one iteration, the concept is called as velocity. The team's first estimate of velocity will always be wrong because we don't have or there is no way to know velocity in advance. However, we can use the initial estimate to make a rough sketch or release plan of what work will happen in each iteration and how many iterations will be needed. To plan a release, we sort stories into various piles, with each pile representing an iteration. So each pile will contain some number of stories and the estimates for which can add up to not more than the estimated velocity. The highest priority stories will always go into the first pile. When the first pile is full, then the next highest priority story will go into the second pile, representing the second iteration, and so on. Now this continues until you have either made so many piles that you are out of the time for the project, or until the piles represent a desirable new release of the project. So prior to the start of each iteration, the customer team can make the mid-course corrections to the plan. As iterations are completed, we learn the development team's actual velocity and can work with that actual velocity instead of estimated velocity. So this means that each pile of stories may need to be adjusted by adding or removing the stories. Also, some stories will turn out to be far easier than anticipated, which means the team will sometimes want to be given an additional story to do in that iteration. But sometimes some stories will be harder than anticipated, which means that some work will need to be moved into the latter iterations, next iterations, or out of the release altogether. So this is all about the process of user stories.